Putin's missiles can't find their targets anymore, and Russia is burning through their precision weapon stockpile, hitting nothing but empty fields. Russian command launches a coordinated missile strike against Ukrainian command centers. Expensive Kaliber cruise missiles, Iskander ballistic missiles, Kinzhal hypersonics. Millions of dollars in precision weapons programmed to hit specific coordinates where intelligence says Ukrainian headquarters are located. The missiles fly perfectly. Navigation works flawlessly. They strike exactly where they're aimed, but there's nothing there. The buildings are empty. The command centers evacuated hours before the missiles launched. Ukrainian forces watched Russian preparations, knew the strike was coming, and simply moved. Every single missile hits an abandoned target. Total cost to Russia, over $50 million. Total damage to Ukraine, some destroyed buildings nobody was using anymore. This is happening repeatedly. Russian missiles striking targets that aren't there, precision weapons hitting coordinates where Ukrainian forces were yesterday but aren't today. It's like Ukraine has an invisible shield that doesn't stop the missiles, it just makes sure they're aimed at the wrong places. Russia is depleting their limited stockpile of precision weapons while accomplishing nothing. Tonight, we're revealing how Ukraine created an invisible shield that makes Russian missiles worthless, why Putin's precision strike capability just became a liability instead of an asset, and what happens when your enemy knows you're coming before you do. The concept of precision strike has dominated military thinking for decades. The ability to hit specific targets with accuracy measured in meters rather than kilometers revolutionized warfare. Instead of carpet bombing entire areas hoping to destroy a target somewhere within the destruction zone, precision weapons allow surgical strikes that destroy specific buildings or even specific rooms within buildings. This capability reduces collateral damage, conserves munitions, and enables operations that would be impossible with area weapons. Russia has invested heavily in precision strike capabilities. Their arsenal includes cruise missiles like the Kaliber that can strike targets over 1,000 kilometers away. Iskander ballistic missiles provide shorter-range precision fires. The Kinzhal hypersonic missile travels at speeds exceeding Mach 5, making interception extremely difficult. Each of these weapons costs millions of dollars and represents sophisticated technology involving guidance systems, propulsion, and warhead design. But precision weapons have a fundamental vulnerability. They're only as good as the intelligence guiding them. A missile that can hit within 2 meters of programmed coordinates is worthless if those coordinates don't represent a valuable target. Precision guidance doesn't help if you're precisely hitting the wrong location. This vulnerability becomes critical when facing an adversary who knows your missiles are coming and can relocate before impact. Ukrainian defense strategy evolved to exploit this weakness. They couldn't prevent Russian missile launches, they didn't have enough air defense to intercept every incoming weapon, but they could make those weapons miss by ensuring they struck empty targets. This required solving two problems: detecting when Russian strikes were imminent and relocating potential targets fast enough that missiles hit abandoned positions. The detection problem was solved through comprehensive intelligence collection. Ukrainian intelligence services, supported by Western partners, maintained constant surveillance of Russian missile forces. Satellites watched launch sites continuously. Signals intelligence monitored communications between Russian command elements and missile units. Human intelligence sources provided advance warning when strikes were being planned. The intelligence picture wasn't perfect, but it was good enough to provide hours of warning before most strikes. Western intelligence contributions were crucial. The United States maintained satellite constellations specifically designed to detect missile launches through infrared sensors that spot the heat signature of rocket motors. When Russian missiles launched, these satellites detected them within seconds and transmitted alerts through secure channels. Ukrainian forces received launch warnings almost instantaneously, providing maximum time to react before missiles arrived. Signals intelligence revealed Russian strike planning before launches occurred. Communications between command centers and missile units discussing target selection, timing, and coordination were intercepted and analyzed. Even encrypted communications provided indicators through patterns of transmission, timing, and network activity. Western intelligence agencies with sophisticated decryption capabilities sometimes broke Russian codes, providing direct access to strike plans. Human intelligence added another layer. Sources within Russian military or adjacent organizations occasionally provided warnings of planned strikes. These sources were limited and carefully protected, but their contributions at critical moments provided intelligence that technical systems couldn't match. A single well-placed source warning of an imminent strike against specific targets could save lives and preserve critical capabilities. With advance warning that strikes were coming, Ukrainian forces needed mobility to exploit that intelligence. Command centers, logistics hubs, and other high-value targets that might be struck needed the ability to relocate quickly. This required planning and preparation. Alternate locations were identified and prepared. Communications equipment was configured for rapid setup and teardown. Personnel were trained on evacuation procedures. The goal was to move critical operations within hours of receiving warning. Mobile command posts became standard for Ukrainian military operations. Rather than operating from fixed buildings that could be targeted, commanders worked from vehicles or temporary facilities that could relocate with minimal notice. Communications were maintained through mobile networks and satellite links that didn't depend on fixed infrastructure. This mobility came at cost in comfort and convenience, but it provided survivability against precision strikes. Decoy installations added deception to mobility. Ukrainian forces prepared sites that looked like legitimate military facilities but were actually empty or contained minimal equipment. These decoys were positioned at locations Russian intelligence might identify as valuable targets. When strikes came, they often hit decoys rather than real facilities. The cost of maintaining decoys was far less than the value of missiles wasted striking them. Some decoys were sophisticated, using thermal generators and electronic emitters to create signatures mimicking active military facilities. Heat sources simulated generators and vehicles. Radio transmitters broadcast signals suggesting communications activity. Visual appearance matched real installations with vehicles, antennas, and structures. From Russian reconnaissance perspectives, these decoys looked like legitimate targets worth expensive missiles. Other decoys were simpler, relying on Russian intelligence limitations. A building in a location where Ukrainian command might plausibly operate, with some minimal indicators like antenna or vehicles, might draw strikes even without elaborate deception. Russian intelligence working from partial information sometimes targeted locations based on educated guesses rather than confirmed knowledge. Those guesses often proved wrong, wasting weapons on empty buildings. The pattern emerged clearly after several months of strikes. Russian missiles consistently hit targets that had been valuable days or weeks earlier, but were abandoned by time of impact. Command posts struck were empty. Ammunition depots hit contained nothing. Logistics hubs targeted had relocated. The precision of Russian missiles didn't matter because the intelligence guiding them was outdated. This outcome resulted from fundamental differences in intelligence cycles. Russian intelligence collection, analysis, and targeting took days or weeks. Satellites photographed potential targets. Analysts examined imagery and identified facilities worth striking. Target coordinates were packaged with intelligence assessments and passed to missile units. Orders were issued and weapons prepared. The process from initial target identification to missile launch often spanned weeks. Ukrainian intelligence about Russian strikes operated on timescales of hours. Detection of launch preparations provided warning measured in hours before missiles flew. This time, compression gave Ukraine decisive advantage. They needed only hours to relocate, while Russian intelligence cycles required weeks to update targeting. The asymmetry meant Russian missiles consistently struck outdated targets. Russian commanders recognized the problem but struggled to solve it. They attempted to compress their intelligence to strike timeline, using real-time reconnaissance and rapidly developed targeting. But accelerating the process introduced errors and reduced strike effectiveness. Hastily developed targets were more likely to be incorrect. The tension between speed and accuracy couldn't be fully resolved with available systems and procedures. Some Russian strikes attempted to target Ukrainian forces in the field rather than fixed facilities. Mobile targets like artillery batteries, air defense systems, or armored vehicles might be located through reconnaissance and struck quickly before they moved, but Ukrainian forces employed extensive camouflage, frequent relocation, and decoys that complicated targeting. Even when Russian reconnaissance found Ukrainian military equipment, confirming it was real rather than decoy required time that often allowed targets to move. The Kinzhal hypersonic missile was supposed to solve the time problem. Its extreme speed, exceeding Mach 10, meant it could strike targets within minutes of launch. This compressed timeline theoretically prevented targets from relocating after launch detection. But Kinzhals were expensive and limited in number. Russia couldn't afford to use them for every strike. They were reserved for highest value targets, which Ukrainian intelligence anticipated and protected with special attention. When Kinzhals were used, Ukrainian forces employed multiple defensive layers. Intelligence hopefully detected launch preparations, providing advance warning. If warning came, targets evacuated preemptively. If no warning or insufficient time to evacuate, mobile air defense systems like Patriot batteries attempted interception. The hypersonic speed made interception difficult but not impossible. Some Kinzhals were destroyed before reaching targets. Others struck but hit evacuated facilities that had been abandoned based on intelligence suggesting they were priority targets. The economics of this invisible shield were brutally favorable to Ukraine. Each Russian missile cost between $1 million and $15 million depending on type. The Kaliber cruise missile cost approximately $1 million. Iskander missiles cost around $3 million. Kinzhal hypersonics were estimated at $15 million or more. When these expensive weapons struck empty targets, Russia lost the missile and achieved nothing. Ukraine's cost was evacuating and relocating, which required fuel, labor, and time, but no expensive hardware losses. Russia's precision missile stockpile was finite. Manufacturing rates couldn't keep pace with consumption. International sanctions limited Russia's access to advanced components needed for precision weapons. Electronics, guidance systems, and specialized materials required for missile production increasingly came from stockpiles rather than new production. Every missile wasted on empty targets was one fewer available for future operations. Ukrainian strategy deliberately encouraged Russian missile expenditure on unproductive targets. By maintaining apparent facilities that were actually decoys or evacuated positions, they presented targets Russian intelligence might identify as valuable. Russian commanders faced pressure to demonstrate they were striking Ukrainian capabilities. Pressure to show results sometimes led to strikes against targets that weren't thoroughly verified. Ukrainian deception exploited this pressure, drawing missiles toward worthless targets. The psychological impact on Russian targeting officers was significant. They prepared strikes based on best available intelligence, authorizing expenditure of expensive limited weapons, only to learn afterward that targets were empty. The pattern of failures created doubt and hesitation. Should they authorize strikes when intelligence might be outdated? Should they wait for better information even though that delay allowed targets to move? Neither option was satisfying, creating paralysis and reduced effectiveness. Russian military leadership faced criticism for wasting precision weapons. Questions arose about intelligence quality and targeting procedures. Why were expensive missiles consistently hitting empty buildings? Were intelligence services being deceived? Were targeting procedures inadequate? Internal blame-seeking and organizational friction degraded Russian effectiveness beyond the direct impact of wasted missiles. Ukrainian forces leveraged the missile-wasting strategy for propaganda purposes. Videos of Russian missiles striking empty buildings were shared widely, demonstrating Russian ineffectiveness and Ukrainian successful deception. Each failed strike became content, showing Russian military incompetence and Ukrainian cleverness. The propaganda value multiplied the strategic effect beyond the immediate tactical outcomes. Western military observers studied Ukrainian techniques with interest. The invisible shield concept, making enemy precision weapons ineffective through intelligence and mobility, offered lessons applicable to other scenarios. Taiwan facing Chinese missile threats, South Korea facing North Korean strikes, NATO forces in potential conflict with Russia. All of these scenarios involved adversaries with precision weapons, and all could potentially employ Ukrainian-style deception and mobility. The key requirements for creating an invisible shield were comprehensive intelligence about enemy strike preparations, mobility to relocate threatened assets, and decoys to draw weapons toward worthless targets. These requirements weren't equally accessible to all potential adopters. Comprehensive intelligence required either indigenous capabilities or reliable partners willing to share. Mobility required logistical capability and operational flexibility. Decoys required resources and expertise. Not every military could implement the full system, but even partial implementation of invisible shield concepts provided some protection. Limited warning was better than no warning. Some mobility was better than fixed positions. Simple decoys were better than no deception. Military forces worldwide began studying how to incorporate these concepts into their defensive planning, even if they couldn't implement them as comprehensively as Ukraine had. The technological dimension of Invisible Shield included electronic warfare. Ukrainian forces used jamming and spoofing to interfere with Russian missile guidance. GPS jamming disrupted satellite navigation used by some Russian weapons. Spoofing created false GPS signals that might lead missiles to incorrect locations. Radar jamming interfered with terminal guidance that missiles used in final approach to targets. These electronic warfare measures added another layer of defense beyond mobility and deception. Cyber operations contributed as well. Ukrainian and allied cyber forces targeted Russian intelligence and command systems. If they could disrupt or corrupt the intelligence feeding Russian targeting, strikes would be less accurate even without Ukrainian forces moving. Malware that altered reconnaissance imagery, corrupted target databases, or interfered with communications between intelligence and strike units could all degrade Russian strike effectiveness. The full extent of cyber operations remained classified, but their impact was evident in Russian difficulties. The cultural factors enabling Ukraine's invisible shield were as important as technical capabilities. Ukrainian military culture emphasized initiative and flexibility. Commanders at all levels were empowered to make decisions about relocating when threatened. Procedures were adaptable rather than rigid. This organizational agility allowed rapid responses to intelligence about threats. More bureaucratic or centralized militaries might struggle to implement similar approaches because they lack the cultural foundation. The dispersed nature of Ukrainian command and control made the invisible shield more effective. Rather than centralized headquarters that presented single high-value targets, Ukrainian forces operated through distributed networks. No single location was critical. Strikes against any individual node didn't paralyze the system. This resilience through distribution complemented the mobility and deception that made strikes miss their targets. Russian forces attempted their own deception efforts, creating false intelligence to make Ukrainian forces misallocate air defense or waste resources protecting sites that wouldn't be struck. But Russian operational security often undermined these efforts. Loose communications discipline and Ukrainian signals intelligence frequently revealed which Russian threats were real versus deception. The asymmetry in intelligence capabilities favored Ukraine, limiting Russian deception effectiveness. The sustainment of invisible shield operations required continuous effort. Intelligence collection never stopped. Every day, Ukrainian analysts worked to maintain awareness of Russian strike capabilities and intentions. Mobility procedures required constant maintenance. Decoy installations needed upkeep to remain convincing. The operational tempo was demanding, but the alternative, absorbing Russian strikes against unprotected targets, was worse. Ukrainian civilian population suffered despite the invisible shield. While military targets were protected through mobility and deception, civilian infrastructure couldn't relocate. Power plants, water systems, bridges, and residential areas remained fixed and vulnerable. Russian strikes increasingly targeted civilian infrastructure as military targeting proved unproductive. The invisible shield protected military capabilities but couldn't prevent attacks on civilians. Russian domestic propaganda struggled to explain the ineffective strikes. State media couldn't acknowledge that expensive missiles were hitting empty buildings without suggesting incompetence or intelligence failures. So they often claimed strikes were successful, destroying valuable Ukrainian capabilities. But soldiers and officers who knew the truth understood the propaganda was false. The disconnect between propaganda and reality eroded trust in official information. The strategic implications of Invisible Shield extended to nuclear deterrence concepts. If conventional precision strikes could be rendered ineffective through intelligence, mobility, and deception, did similar principles apply to nuclear weapons? Could nuclear targets be protected by similar approaches? The questions were uncomfortable because they challenged assumptions underlying nuclear deterrence. Most analysts concluded nuclear weapons remained different because of their overwhelming destructive power, but the questions persisted. Some Russian military theorists argued that the solution to Invisible Shield was saturation attacks using massive numbers of weapons simultaneously to overwhelm Ukrainian abilities to evacuate targets. But Russia didn't have enough missiles for such attacks. Their production rates and stockpile sizes didn't support saturation strikes against multiple target sets. The approach was theoretically sound but practically infeasible given resource constraints. The Invisible Shield wasn't impenetrable. Some Russian strikes succeeded in hitting valuable targets. Intelligence wasn't perfect. Mobility wasn't always fast enough. Decoys didn't always fool Russian analysts, but the success rate was low enough that Russian missile strikes became strategically ineffective. They consumed resources without producing proportionate military results. The cost-benefit equation decisively favored Ukraine. Russian frustration with ineffective strikes occasionally led to reduced targeting standards that only made the problem worse. Rather than waiting for high-confidence intelligence about valuable targets, they struck based on lower quality information or hit targets of marginal value just to demonstrate activity. The pressure came from multiple directions. Political leadership demanded visible results to show the Russian public that military operations were succeeding. Military commanders needed to justify the resources being allocated to missile forces. Intelligence services faced criticism for their inability to provide effective targeting. All of this pressure drove decisions to launch strikes even when intelligence was incomplete or suspect. This reduced effectiveness further, wasting weapons on even less valuable targets than before. A building that might house a Ukrainian logistics office, based on fragmentary intelligence, would be struck even though the presence of anything militarily significant was uncertain. An installation that satellite imagery suggested could be a command post, but which might equally be civilian infrastructure, received missiles that would have been better saved for confirmed military targets. The desperation to demonstrate activity and justify continued operations led to progressively lower standards for what constituted a worthy target. The pressure to show results drove counterproductive behavior throughout the Russian military targeting chain. Intelligence analysts who might have previously withheld uncertain assessments until more information was available now felt compelled to provide targets even when confidence was low. They knew that failure to produce targeting intelligence resulted in criticism from superiors who needed strikes to demonstrate productivity. So they provided targets with appropriate caveats about uncertainty, but those caveats often got stripped away as information moved up command chains. By the time strike orders were issued, targets presented as confirmed often rested on much shakier intelligence foundations. Operational commanders authorized strikes they might have questioned more rigorously in different circumstances. The organizational pressure was intense. Not striking meant appearing inactive or ineffective. Striking, even with dubious intelligence, at least showed they were doing something. The possibility that missiles might hit empty buildings was acceptable compared to the certainty of criticism for not employing available weapons. This organizational dynamic created perverse incentives where launching ineffective strikes was rewarded more than conserving weapons until better targets were identified. The result was a vicious cycle of declining effectiveness. As more strikes hit empty or low-value targets, pressure increased to demonstrate success. This pressure drove more strikes with lower standards, which hit even less valuable targets, increasing pressure further. Russian missile effectiveness spiraled downward while stockpiles depleted and Ukrainian forces learned to exploit Russian desperation. What began as a precision strike capability degraded into barely targeted harassment that consumed expensive weapons while accomplishing little. Ukrainian confidence grew with each failed Russian strike, transforming the psychological balance of the conflict. Soldiers who initially feared missile attacks learned that those attacks rarely hit anything important. The sirens would sound. Personnel would take cover. Missiles would impact somewhere. Then, after assessing damage, Ukrainian forces discovered the strikes hit abandoned buildings, empty warehouses, or decoy installations. The pattern repeated so consistently that fear transformed into contempt. Russian missiles became background noise, dangerous but rarely effective. The psychological advantage shifted dramatically from Russia to Ukraine through this repeated failure. Ukrainian forces operated with increasing boldness, while Russian commanders grew more cautious, knowing their precision strikes weren't achieving intended effects. Ukrainian units moved openly in areas they might have hidden from if Russian strikes were effective. Supply convoys traveled routes they would have avoided if Russian targeting was accurate. Command posts operated from locations they would have evacuated if strikes were hitting their targets. The invisibility provided by the shield enabled operational freedom that translated directly to combat effectiveness. Russian commanders faced the opposite psychological dynamic. They knew their most sophisticated weapons were failing to accomplish their missions. The expensive missiles that were supposed to provide decisive long-range strike capability were proving largely worthless. This knowledge created hesitation and doubt throughout the command chain. Should they continue expending limited stockpiles on ineffective strikes, or should they conserve weapons for scenarios where targeting might be more reliable? Neither option was attractive, creating organizational paralysis that further degraded effectiveness. The invisible shield provided moral advantage beyond its physical protection. Ukrainian forces gained confidence from their ability to defeat Russian strikes through cleverness rather than just absorbing them through endurance. They weren't just surviving Russian missile attacks, they were making Russia waste resources while accomplishing nothing. This created narrative of Ukrainian ingenuity triumphing over Russian brute force. The moral boost was significant, reinforcing Ukrainian determination while undermining Russian confidence. The long-term impact on military procurement and doctrine worldwide will be significant and is already reshaping strategic thinking in defense establishments globally. If precision weapons can be rendered ineffective through intelligence and mobility, are they worth the massive investments many nations are making? The question challenges decades of procurement priorities that emphasized expensive precision-guided munitions as centerpiece of modern military capability. Or should resources shift toward capabilities that are harder to counter, like hypersonic weapons that compress timelines beyond defender ability to react, or massed cheaper weapons that overwhelm through quantity rather than precision? These questions are driving debate in defense establishments globally with implications measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. The United States has invested enormously in precision strike capabilities across all military services. China is building similar arsenals. European nations maintain smaller but still significant precision weapon stockpiles. If Ukraine's invisible shield demonstrates that these weapons can be countered by adversaries with good intelligence and operational discipline, the entire strategic calculus changes. Defense planners are reassessing assumptions, running simulations, and questioning whether current procurement plans make sense given what Ukraine has demonstrated. Ukraine's invisible shield demonstrated that expensive, exquisite weapons face vulnerabilities that clever adversaries can exploit. The demonstration is forcing uncomfortable recognition that technological sophistication doesn't guarantee military effectiveness. An expensive missile that costs millions but consistently hits empty targets is worse than useless. It's actively counterproductive because it consumes limited resources while accomplishing nothing. This lesson applies beyond missiles to broader questions about military investment. Complex, expensive systems face vulnerabilities that simpler, cheaper alternatives might not. The balance between capability and vulnerability is more nuanced than procurement processes often acknowledge. For Ukraine, the invisible shield represented another successful adaptation in their ongoing effort to survive against a larger adversary. Throughout the conflict, Ukraine has consistently demonstrated ability to innovate faster than Russia can adapt. They couldn't prevent Russian missile launches through direct action. Their air defense capabilities, while improving with Western assistance, couldn't intercept every weapon. The missile production industrial base and stockpile sizes were decisively in Russia's favor, but they could make those weapons miss by being somewhere else when missiles arrived, turning Russian advantage into liability. This simple concept, executed through sophisticated intelligence and disciplined operational security, neutralized billions of dollars of Russian precision strike investment. The execution wasn't simple despite the conceptual simplicity. It required intelligence collection and analysis infrastructure that could detect Russian strike preparations hours in advance. It required mobility procedures that allowed rapid relocation of threatened assets. It required operational security that prevented Russians from detecting evacuation movements. It required decoys that drew strikes toward worthless targets. It required electronic warfare that interfered with missile guidance. All of these elements needed to work together consistently across hundreds of potential targets for months of sustained operations. For Russia, the inability to effectively employ precision weapons represented strategic failure with profound implications. They'd developed capabilities specifically to strike high-value targets at range, investing decades of research and billions of rubles. Those capabilities were proven in Syria and other conflicts where adversaries lacked sophisticated intelligence or couldn't execute the defensive measures Ukraine employed. The weapons worked as designed. Russian technical achievement was real. But against Ukraine's invisible shield, the weapons that were supposed to provide decisive advantage proved largely ineffective. Missiles flew accurately to wrong targets, wasting precious stockpile without achieving military objectives. Each failed strike represented not just wasted weapon, but wasted opportunity. That missile could have been saved for a scenario where targeting was more reliable. The components could have been used for other military systems. The resources consumed in production could have supported other capabilities. Instead, expensive precision weapons struck empty buildings, providing no military value while depleting stockpiles that couldn't be rapidly replaced due to production limitations and sanctions. The invisible shield wasn't magic or advanced technology beyond Russian comprehension. It was intelligence, mobility, deception, and electronic warfare coordinated through disciplined operations and enabled by Western support. Each component was understandable and theoretically counterable, but executing effective counters required capabilities Russia didn't have and organizational agility they struggled to achieve. The simplicity of the concept made Russian inability to counter it more frustrating. They weren't defeated by incomprehensible technology. They were defeated by straightforward tactics executed better than they could respond to. But to Russian commanders watching their expensive missiles strike empty buildings repeatedly, it felt like Ukraine had developed defensive capabilities beyond what should be possible. Their precision weapons couldn't find targets anymore despite functioning perfectly from technical perspective. The missiles flew their programmed courses accurately. Guidance systems worked as designed. Warheads detonated properly. Everything worked except the one thing that mattered. The targets weren't there when missiles arrived. The invisible shield had rendered Putin's missile arsenal largely worthless, not by destroying the weapons, but by ensuring they destroyed nothing of value. On March 10, 2026, and on dozens of similar days before and after, Russian missiles flew perfectly to targets that weren't there. The launches were detected by satellites. Ukrainian forces watched launches, received warnings through intelligence channels, and evacuated threatened locations. When missiles struck minutes or hours later, they hit buildings, but the people and equipment that made those buildings valuable were gone. Russia burned through their limited stockpile, hitting nothing but empty structures, achieving destruction without military effect. And Ukraine's invisible shield, built not from physical barriers but from intelligence and mobility, kept their forces safe while Russia's precision weapons proved precise at hitting the wrong places. The shield that didn't stop missiles but made them miss had neutered Putin's precision strike capability in ways that reverberated through global military thinking. The assumption that precision weapons provided decisive advantage was challenged. The belief that technological sophistication guaranteed effectiveness was questioned. And modern warfare's assumptions about precision weapons would never be quite the same, because Ukraine had demonstrated that intelligence and agility could defeat expensive technology, and that the invisible shield of knowing what's coming was more valuable than the physical armor of trying to survive what hits.